Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 5, about the executive branch, and this is Lesson 7, dealing with the presidential ideal. In this lesson, you'll learn about the ideal of CINCINNATUS, the model of George Washington, and the reality of the Roosevelts. George Washington, who's sometimes called the father of our country, was the president of the Constitutional Convention. That's significant to note because the convention delegates, while they were designing the presidency for the United States, had a person sitting there in the room with them that they used as the model that they wanted to design the presidency for. They were hoping that it would always have someone like George Washington in it. So to understand what they were trying to accomplish by modeling it after George Washington, it's helpful for us to understand what kind of person George Washington was. And to understand what kind of person George Washington was, it's helpful to understand who his hero was. George Washington admired and even patterned his life after a man named CINCINNATUS. CINCINNATUS was a retired Roman general when the important thing that happened in his life occurred, for which George Washington and others so greatly admired him. The story that's told of CINCINNATUS is that after he had retired, he was living on a small farm outside of Rome. And one day he was out plowing the field on his farm when a group of Roman senators approached him. They explained that the country was facing a crisis, and they needed someone to come to Rome and take over as dictator. Now, dictator was an actual office in the government of Rome. It was just what you think it is. It's where the name comes from. It was a position where they would allow someone to have nearly absolute power to deal with some sort of immediate emergency. It was a position that was rarely filled because there was always a danger that if you gave someone that sort of absolute power, they would then use it to make themselves more powerful. They would go from being dictator in name to becoming a tyrant in practice. But CINCINNATUS, after going and completing the task that the Senate was asking him to do, which was to deal with some invading barbarians that they were faced with, he did something amazing. He resigned his dictatorship. He was given absolute power, and when he had finished dealing with the problem, he immediately surrendered that absolute power. And the way the story goes, he went back to his plow in the field to finish what he had been doing before. And amazingly, several years later, the Senate went back to him a second time and invited him to come become dictator again to deal with another problem. This was a conspiracy within their own government to assassinate one of their leaders. And again, he took care of that. And then at the end, he resigned the dictatorship and went back to his farm. This is such a compelling story in human history and made CINCINNATUS a hero in Roman history because it's a rare thing to have happen, to give someone absolute power and then them voluntarily give that power up. So George Washington tried to be like CINCINNATUS. After the American Revolution, when he had guided the colonial troops to victory over the British Army, George Washington was the most popular man in the colonies. He was also, by chance, likely the wealthiest man in the colonies too. Well, the man that's that popular and that wealthy could have become king if he had wanted to be. There were people who openly talked about the idea of making George Washington king of the colonies now that they were independent. But he refused that. He didn't want it. He had no interest in it. Instead, George Washington retired to his farm, which was called Mount Vernon, to work the soil, make a living, save for his family. It was while he was in retirement at Mount Vernon that then he was approached by people who wanted him to attend the Constitutional Convention, which he reluctantly did. And then after the Constitution was written, with the office of presidency in it, other people then approached him about potentially becoming the first president of the United States. George Washington only reluctantly agreed to be put up as a potential president of the United States. He was then unanimously elected by the Electoral College, which we're going to discuss in a later lesson. He then reluctantly ran for a second term in office, and after 2 terms, he decided there was no way he could continue. He didn't want to be doing this job. He only did it because he was asked to do it, and he once again retired to his farm in Virginia. So, from the model of George Washington, and from the ideal that he was following of Cincinnatus, we get this idea that the presidency was expected to be an act of public service, not personal ambition. That the great men of America might choose to become president, not because they really wanted to become president, but because their country needed them to be president. Now let's contrast that attitude of George Washington Cincinnatus with the attitude of first Teddy Roosevelt and then Franklin Roosevelt. Now don't misunderstand this comparison. I'm not trying to say that Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt were bad presidents. There are some historians that believe they're among our best presidents. But their attitude toward power was definitely different than that of Cincinnatus or George Washington. Teddy Roosevelt was a career politician. Prior to becoming vice president of the United States, he was the governor of New York. Then he served as vice president and then as president for 2 terms. After leaving office as president after 2 terms, which he felt kind of forced to do because of the tradition of George Washington. See, once George Washington had served only two terms, future presidents felt like they could only be elected president twice also. So Teddy Roosevelt followed that example of George Washington, and he did not run for president to become president for a 3rd term. But before he left office, he said to his followers, his supporters, he was still very popular, you should vote for this other guy, William Howard Taft. And so they did. Taft became the president. But it didn't take very long for Roosevelt, after he was out of office, to begin looking over Taft's shoulder and deciding that he could be doing things better himself if he was still president. So 4 years later, he ran for president again. But Taft was already the sitting president running for re-election. And so their Republican Party nominated Taft to be president again. Well, that wasn't enough to stop Teddy Roosevelt. He formed his own political party, which became known as the Bull Moose Party. And he actually defeated Taft. He got more votes than Taft. The problem is they split the votes on their side of the political spectrum. And Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee for president, became president instead. Well, that still didn't stop Teddy Roosevelt. Once Woodrow Wilson was finishing up his 2nd term in office and was going to retire from politics also, he was actually quite ill, Teddy Roosevelt decided that he should run again for the presidency in 1920. It was only ill health and his eventual death that stopped him from doing so. He likely would have been the nominee of the Republican Party yet again. So the reason I tell you this history of Teddy Roosevelt is to show that he was a man who loved the idea of being president. He was ambitious, wanted power, and the most powerful position that he could have as a citizen of the United States of America is to become president of the United States. And so that's what he wanted to be. And once he had a taste of it, he didn't want to give that thing up. A few years later, his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, ran for president. Now, you can see Franklin Roosevelt here in this picture sitting in a car. The reason for that is that Franklin Roosevelt was actually paralyzed from the waist down because of the disease polio. He tried to hide that from the American people, so he would go around campaigning from the back seat of a convertible automobile. Drive around, he would even drive onto stages to give his speeches. And so he drove around the country despite his ailment and the difficulties that it caused him in his life, and ambitiously pursued the presidency. Like his cousin, prior to running for president, he'd been governor of New York. And that wasn't the only office he'd served in. He was another career politician. He was elected president in 1932, elected again in 1936. At that point, he had served 2 terms, and the Washington tradition said that he should retire. But he broke that tradition and ran for president again in 1940, and then ran for president again in 1944. And it was during his fourth term in office that he died while the president of the United States. Now, again, this isn't to say that Franklin Roosevelt was a bad president, but it's to illustrate how ambitious he was. This is the kind of politician that the presidency ended up attracting. Not people like Cincinnatus and Washington, but people like Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt. So modern presidential candidates, are not reluctant public servants like George Washington was. Instead, they are ambitious and power hungry, and that is why they want to serve in the office of president. So let's review what we learned in this lesson. Why is Cincinnatus remembered? Is it because he had to be assassinated? Is it because he was the president of Rome? Is it because he conquered Rome? Or is it because he voluntarily gave up power? Cincinnatus is remembered because he voluntarily gave up power. What tradition did Washington set for the presidency? Was it that a president only serves one term in office? Or that a president only serves 2 terms in office? Or is it that a president does not go to war? Or is it that a president follows a particular political party? George Washington set the tradition that presidents should only serve 2 terms. How did the Roosevelts differ from George Washington? Were they much younger than Washington, or were they much older than Washington? Is it that they wanted to be president, or that they retired from politics after being president? It's the fact that they wanted to be president so desperately. Remember, George Washington didn't want to be president. He only reluctantly accepted being president as an act of service for his country. The Roosevelts, whether they were good presidents or not, certainly wanted to be president. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will be from Unit 5. It'll be Lesson 8 about the Electoral College.